What you are about to hear is not a news report. This is not a segment from a cable network. This is the unfiltered, unedited, classified level account of what is happening right now in the Persian Gulf. And I promise you, by the time I'm done, you are going to understand why everything you've been told about this war is a carefully constructed lie. Because the fires you are seeing on your screen, those are not explosions from a battlefield somewhere far away. Those are the refineries. Those are the oil fields. Those are the gas installations that pump the blood of the global economy. And somebody just pulled the trigger without asking anyone's permission. Stay with me, because what happened in the last 72 hours didn't just redraw the map of the Middle East. It may have set the entire world on a countdown clock that nobody is ready to talk about. Welcome. Let's begin. Let me paint you a picture first, because without the full picture, none of what comes next makes any sense. The Persian Gulf, this body of water you can cross in a car in under an hour at its narrowest point, is responsible for more than 20% of all the oil produced on this planet. 20%. And it is the origin point of roughly 70% of the natural gas that keeps the lights on across all of Europe. Every hospital, every factory, every heated home from Lisbon to Warsaw runs on energy that flows through this waterway. When people talk about the Strait of Hormuz, they speak of it in almost mythological terms, as if it were some abstract geopolitical concept. It is not abstract. It is a 17-mile choke point through which 17 to 20% of all globally traded oil passes every single day. And right now, someone is shooting at the machines that make it work. This is not a regional conflict. This is the fuse on a bomb that sits underneath the entire global economy, and somebody just lit it. The question is who, and more importantly, why now? Here is what the mainstream media is not explaining to you clearly enough, so I'm going to say it slowly. Israel launched a direct military strike against the South Pars gas field in the Persian Gulf. This is not speculation. This is confirmed. The South Pars field, shared between Iran and Qatar along a maritime border, is the single largest natural gas deposit on planet Earth. Let me repeat that because the magnitude of it needs to sink in. The largest gas reserve on the face of this Earth. Iran's portion, known as South Pars, provides approximately 70% of all the domestic gas consumed inside Iran. It is the oxygen mask of their entire energy economy. 40% of the raw material Iran needs to produce gasoline for its own population comes out of that single field. Without South Pars, Iran doesn't just lose energy. Iran loses the ability to function as a modern state, and Israel bombed it. Not after a summit, not after consultations, not after a green light from anyone. Israel bombed it and didn't tell Washington a thing. And right there, right at that precise moment, the entire architecture of this war changed forever. Here is where I need you to understand something about the man in the White House, because this is the key that unlocks everything else. Donald Trump, the disruptor, the showman, the man who built his entire identity on The Apprentice and the art of the instant win, came into this conflict looking for a trophy. He wanted a moment. He wanted the clip. He wanted to stand at that podium and say the words that would guarantee his legacy. We destroyed Iran's nuclear program. America won. We did it fast. We did it clean. The problem is, war doesn't produce those clips on demand. And the man who wanted a fast win just walked into the Middle East version of Vietnam. Think about this carefully. On day one of this conflict, Donald Trump told the world that the United States military had achieved total dominance over Iran. He posted, and I am not making this up, that Iran's nuclear capability was gone, that everything was rubble, that America had won and it would be over very soon. And then, within days of that announcement, Iran launched a full-scale retaliatory strike against oil refineries across the Gulf. Not against military targets, not against radar installations or air bases, against oil infrastructure, against the economic jugular vein of the entire region. If Iran was rubble, if their military had been reduced to stone over stone, as Trump himself suggested, then how exactly were they still firing? How were they still launching precision strikes against critical infrastructure? The answer to that question is the answer to everything, and it is one that certain very powerful people desperately do not want you to ask. Let me take you underground for a moment, because that is where the real war is being fought. For decades, Not years, decades. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been building one of the most sophisticated subterranean military infrastructures in human history. We are not talking about a few bunkers. We are talking about thousands of kilometers of tunnels, carved into the bedrock of the Iranian countryside, running beneath deserts, beneath mountains, beneath cities, beneath everything. Inside those tunnels, missiles, drones, launch platforms, fuel, personnel, command and control systems. Everything you need to fight a war, invisible from the sky, invisible from satellites, invisible from every intelligence asset that the United States and Israel have spent billions of dollars deploying. The IRGC doesn't need visible military bases to wage war. Their entire launch capability, a significant percentage of their most lethal arsenal, can be deployed directly from the desert floor, from camouflaged positions that reveal themselves only at the moment of launch. You cannot bomb what you cannot see. And that, right there, is the fatal miscalculation that has turned this operation into something neither Trump nor Netanyahu was prepared for. The former director of the Counterterrorism Intelligence Division just resigned. Not retired, resigned. He walked out. He gave an interview. He said, directly on record, that he could not support this war because Iran never represented a genuine nuclear threat to the United States at the scale that was sold to the American public to justify this operation. That is an intelligence professional who spent years inside the system telling you that the premise of this war was false. And what happened to him? The FBI opened an investigation. They are investigating the man who told the truth. They are killing the messenger rather than examining the message. Does that sound like a government that is winning a war built on solid intelligence? Or does it sound like a government that is desperately trying to silence the people who can expose the gap between the narrative and the reality on the ground? Now let me tell you about Benjamin Netanyahu, the ruthless architect, because his role in this specific escalation is something the American public needs to understand in detail. The South Pars strike was not coordinated with Washington. Trump himself confirmed this. He went on his own platform and posted that the United States had no knowledge of the Israeli attack on the South Pars gas field. None. Zero. He said Israel launched unilaterally and that Qatar had no involvement, which had to be said out loud because South Pars is physically shared with Qatar's North Field. And the same detonations that targeted Iran's infrastructure sent shockwaves through infrastructure Qatar depends on for its own energy exports. Think about what that means for a moment. America's closest Arab partner in the region, the country that just gifted Donald Trump a Boeing 747 valued at $400 million. A gift so large that multiple constitutional lawyers publicly stated it likely violated the emoluments clause of the United States Constitution. That country just had its energy infrastructure caught in the crossfire of an operation the United States didn't authorize. And now Trump is on record protecting Qatar, saying Israel will not strike South Pars again, and warning Iran that if they target Qatar, America will respond with or without Israeli involvement. The $400 million airplane matters here. I want you to hold that number in your mind as I explain the next part, because the financial architecture of this conflict tells you more about the decision-making than any military briefing ever could. Qatar is the second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, behind only the United States. The LNG that flows out of Qatar's North Field, the Qatar side of the same deposit that Israel just bombed on the Iranian side, heats homes across Europe. It powers industrial production from Germany to Italy to Poland. It is the reason that European energy markets haven't completely collapsed since the Ukraine conflict began. And Trump has direct, documented financial relationships with the Qatari government, culminating in the single most expensive gift ever given to any American official by a foreign government in modern history. When Israel bombed South Pars without telling anyone, they didn't just escalate a war. They put a lit match next to $400 million worth of American presidential goodwill. And that, more than any strategic consideration, is why Trump went public to distance himself from the strike. This is not foreign policy. This is asset protection. But here is the thing about fires in the Gulf that you need to understand on a visceral level. And I am going to be very direct with you because the mainstream press is dancing around this with the kind of careful language that obscures the true horror of the situation. When Iran responded to the South Pars strike by launching attacks against oil refineries across the Persian Gulf, against Saudi Arabia, against the UAE, against Qatar, they were not retaliating against military targets. They were targeting the economic immune system of an entire civilization. Every barrel of oil that cannot flow through that region means higher prices at your pump, higher costs for every product made from petroleum, higher electricity bills, higher food prices, higher everything. The Iranian strike is not a military operation. It is an economic weapon of mass destruction. And the fact that oil prices immediately broke through the $100 per barrel ceiling, a number that Trump had specifically identified as the threshold he did not want crossed because of what it means for American consumers, tells you everything about how this is going. The disruptor got disrupted, and now the Gulf Cooperation Council nations are demanding that Iran halt its attacks, while simultaneously nobody is asking Israel to explain why it blew up the world's largest gas deposit without checking with anyone first. The geopolitical logic of that asymmetry is staggering, and it explains exactly why the countries of the Gulf, the same countries that depend on American security guarantees, are starting to look at Washington with a kind of horrified uncertainty they have not felt in decades. Let me bring you back to Trump for a moment, because what he is doing right now is something I need you to see clearly. Not because it is unusual for this president, but because in the context of an active military escalation in the world's most economically critical waterway, the disconnect between his public narrative and observable reality has reached a level that should genuinely alarm every single person watching. After Iran bombed the Gulf refineries, after oil crossed $100 a barrel, after Israel launched a strike Trump had no knowledge of, after Qatar, the country that gave him the plane, had its energy infrastructure hit by Iranian missiles. After all of that, Trump posted that America had won the war with Iran, that there was nothing left but rubble, that he is the greatest negotiator in history, that nobody makes war and peace better than him. He listed, and you can go read this yourself, that he has ended wars in 8 or 9 countries, some of which, I will be honest with you, do not appear to exist in any historical record outside of his own statements. Nobody is stronger than me. Nobody has better toys than me. Nobody builds walls better than me. Nobody is more pro-Israel than me. I am not editorializing. These are his actual words on record, repeated across years of public statements. The man who is managing the most dangerous military escalation in the Persian Gulf in decades genuinely believes that the sheer force of his self-declaration is a substitute for strategic coherence. And the problem, the terrifying, stomach-dropping problem, is that the Gulf doesn't care how good you say you are at negotiating. The refineries are still on fire. This brings me to something that a serious military historian would immediately recognize as a pattern. The United States made this exact mistake before. In Vietnam, the most devastating strategic humiliation in American military history, the failure was not one of firepower. America had more firepower than any force in Vietnam could dream of. The failure was architectural. The Viet Cong moved through jungles, through tunnels, through terrain that American military doctrine was not designed to engage. You cannot bomb an enemy you cannot locate. You cannot declare victory over a force that exists below the surface. The IRGC's tunnel networks are Iran's jungle, the thousands of kilometers of subterranean infrastructure, the mobile launch platforms that can emerge from the desert and fire and disappear again before a satellite can track them, the dispersed command and control that survives decapitation strikes because it was never centralized in the first place. These are not failures of American intelligence gathering. They are the product of 40 years of deliberate Iranian investment in exactly the kind of warfare that American air power cannot defeat from altitude. And Trump, who came to this conflict looking for a quick win on camera, just walked into the same trap with desert sand instead of jungle canopy. Here is what keeps me up at night about the next 30 days. And I want to be precise about this because the stakes are too high for vague warnings. Right now, on both sides of this conflict, there is a category of infrastructure that nobody has yet targeted. Infrastructure so critical, so irreplaceable, that attacking it would move this war from severe escalation to genuine civilizational catastrophe in the span of a single night. I am talking about desalination plants. The countries of the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, do not have rivers. They do not have lakes. They do not have aquifers sufficient to sustain their populations. Every glass of drinking water, every irrigation system, every industrial process that requires fresh water in those nations is produced by desalination facilities running around the clock. If either side decides, and the capability exists on both sides, to target those plants, you are not looking at an energy crisis. You are not looking at a price spike. You are looking at countries with populations of millions that could face critical water shortages within 2 to 3 weeks. That is not a hypothetical. That is physics. And right now, with the IRGC having already demonstrated the willingness to strike economic infrastructure that was previously considered off-limits, and with Israel having demonstrated the willingness to attack targets without coordinating with Washington, the ladder of escalation has rungs that the entire international community should be terrified to see anyone step on. And yet, and this is the part that I find almost incomprehensible as I watch it unfold, the man who is nominally in command of the American side of this operation is posting on social media that the war is won, while the fires burn, while the oil price climbs, while his intelligence director resigns in protest, while the allies he is supposed to be protecting look at Washington and see a government that couldn't even keep its closest ally from bombing a shared gas field without warning. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain Trump's public narrative in the face of the observable facts on the ground is not just extraordinary, it is operationally dangerous. Because every foreign capital that is watching this, Tehran, Beijing, Moscow, Riyadh, every capital in Europe, is making a calculation right now about what American deterrence actually means in practice when the commander-in-chief is declaring victory over a war that is visibly, demonstrably, still raging. Let me talk about this supreme leader for a moment. The man I want you to understand not as a symbol, but as a strategic actor who has spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this scenario. Khamenei is not sweating in a bunker somewhere hoping for mercy. I know that is not the image that certain media want you to carry. The cornered supreme leader, the desperate old man clinging to power as his regime crumbles. That narrative is comforting and it is wrong. What Khamenei has is patience. 40 years of patience. The entire doctrine of the Islamic Republic's military strategy is built on the concept of strategic depth, on the understanding that Iran cannot win a conventional war against the United States and Israel in the open field, so it will never fight one. It will fight a war of attrition, asymmetric pressure, proxy escalation, economic pain, and delay. It will make any resolution so costly and so complicated that the other side eventually looks for an exit. Khamenei watched what happened to Saddam Hussein. He watched what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. He watched what happened to every leader who tried to fight America conventionally. And he built his entire military doctrine as the answer to that lesson. The underground tunnels are not a sign of weakness. They are the physical manifestation of a strategy that says, you cannot destroy what you cannot find, and we have had 40 years to hide everything that matters. Now, here is the question that I think defines the next phase of this conflict more than any other. Trump came to this war wanting a signature moment, the kind of clean, fast, visually dramatic win that plays well on television and translates directly into political capital. The Venezuela operation gave him that. The extraction of a sitting head of state in a nighttime commando raid, whatever you think of the legality or the geopolitical implications, was exactly the kind of spectacle that Trump's political identity was built to produce and exploit. Fast, decisive, photogenic, a trophy. Iran was supposed to be the same story. It is not the same story. Iran is the story that refuses to end on his timeline. And when a man who built his entire identity on the fast win encounters a conflict that demands long-term strategic patience and resource commitment, what happens is exactly what we are watching right now. Desperate patching, contradictory messaging, allies doing whatever they want without coordination, and a man standing at a podium declaring victory while the building behind him is still on fire. But here's what I need you to hold on to as we close, because I will not leave you in despair without giving you the full picture. The IRGC's inner circle is not invulnerable. The strikes that have already landed, the elimination of key figures in Iran's military and intelligence command structure, the damage to their exposed infrastructure, the financial pressure from sanctions, these are real. The regime is operating under genuine stress that it has not experienced in this combination before. The question is not whether the pressure is real. The question is whether the strategy behind the pressure is coherent enough to translate that stress into an actual resolution. And right now, with Israel acting unilaterally, with Trump declaring victory on social media while oil markets tell a completely different story, with a former intelligence director getting investigated for telling the truth, that coherence is not visible. What is visible is an improvised escalation ladder that nobody seems to be controlling, climbing toward a floor that, if it breaks, will drop us all into something that nobody on this planet is prepared for. Here is what I want you to watch in the next 72 hours. Watch the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran moves to restrict passage through that waterway, even partially, even as a signal rather than a full closure, the global oil market will react with a violence that makes today's price spike look mild. Watch Qatar. The Qatari government has already expelled Iranian diplomats in response to the South Par's aftermath. But Qatar is also the country whose energy exports Europe depends on, and whose royal family just gave the American president a plane. The pressure on Doha right now, caught between Washington, Tehran, and Riyadh, in a conflict that literally blew up their side of the world's biggest gas field, is unlike anything that tiny peninsula has faced before. And watch Trump. Watch specifically whether his tweets continue to describe a war that is won, or whether the language starts to shift. Because the moment the language shifts, you will know that the people around him have finally managed to breach the wall of self-congratulation and show him what the situation actually looks like from the intelligence reports, rather than from the cable news chyrons. The map of the Middle East was already on fire before this week. What happened in the last 72 hours didn't just add fuel to that fire. It opened a trapdoor that leads to a level of this conflict that none of the principals, not Trump, not Netanyahu, not Khamenei, fully planned for. And the most dangerous thing in the world right now is not any single weapon, any single military unit, or any single decision made by any single leader. The most dangerous thing right now is a war with no coherent exit strategy, fought by parties who have stopped communicating with each other, escalating through a series of uncoordinated actions toward a set of targets that, once struck, cannot be unbuilt. The desalination plants are still standing. The strait is still open. The world is still, barely, recognizable. But the men making the decisions that will determine whether any of that remains true next week are operating on different timelines, different information sets, different personal imperatives. And one of them just declared victory on social media, while his allies bombed the largest gas deposit on Earth without telling him. So I am going to ask you the question that keeps me awake tonight, the question that every government in the world is quietly asking in rooms where cameras are not allowed. If this is what winning looks like, what does losing look like? Stay subscribed, because the next move, whoever makes it, will tell us everything.